He was just an ordinary fisherman looking for a place where some water still remained. But instead of fish, he found something no one could have imagined. A massive abandoned cruise ship stranded at the bottom of a dried reservoir. When he went inside, his life would never be the same again. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The summer came heavier than any other in memory. The sky had forgotten what it meant to rain, and the earth had stopped waiting for mercy. What once had been a glittering stretch of water, alive with fish and reeds, and the songs of frogs at dusk, was now a wound across the land, a hollow basin where the bones of the earth showed through the cracked clay. The air itself smelled of dust and heat, and when the wind passed over the valley, it carried with it the scent of rust and old algae, a ghost of the lake that used to live there. Crows circled lazily over the exposed bed, calling to each other as if mocking the silence below. Victor Tallis had lived beside that water for 20 years, in a sagging wooden house that leaned toward the emptiness, as though it too longed for what was gone. He had once been a sailor, a man who belonged to waves and salt, a man who knew how to measure the moods of the sea by the weight of the wind. Now his world was small, a shack with peeling paint, a battered rowboat resting uselessly on dry ground, and the company of the wind that spoke in the language of creaking boards. Since the death of his wife, the world had narrowed to routines, setting out his fishing lines at dawn, patching nets he no longer needed, sitting on the porch with a cigarette as twilight came down like smoke. When the water began to recede that spring, he'd watched it from the hill behind his house. At first it had seemed natural, a season of dryness, a shift in the soil. But then the shore crept backward faster and faster, like a retreating army. The fishermen moved their boats. The birds left. The air filled with the smell of rotting weeds. And when the last shallow pool steamed under the summer sun, even the sound of frogs disappeared. The reservoir was dead, and what remained looked like another planet. One afternoon, Victor took his walking stick and went down to the exposed bed, more out of habit than curiosity. He had once read that when lakes dry up, they reveal things long forgotten. Bridges, towns, lost vehicles. Perhaps, he thought, there might be something to see. He moved slowly down the slope, the cracked mud crunching under his boots, the air shimmering with heat. Here and there, the skeleton of a catfish jutted from the clay. Rusted beer cans glinted in the sunlight, relics of tourists who had once crowded the shore. He reached what used to be the central basin, where the water had been deepest. The ground was a patchwork of broken tiles of clay, each one curling at the edges like burnt paper. He walked farther than he'd intended, the emptiness drawing him forward. The sun sat directly above, a white coin in a sky too bright to look at. Then in the distance, something caught his eye. A flash of silver, a shape too smooth to be rock. At first, he thought it might be a large pipe or the roof of an old barge abandoned during the flooding years ago. But as he came closer, the scale began to change. What had seemed small from afar grew impossibly large. The object wasn't half buried. It was enormous, stretching farther than his eyes could follow. The closer he walked, the more the shape revealed itself. Curving lines, rows of portholes clouded with silt, a railing twisted by time, his breath caught in his throat. The thing before him wasn't a barge. It was a ship. He stood frozen for a long moment, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. The hull rose out of the earth like the back of a dead whale, streaked with orange rust and streaks of salt. On its side, beneath layers of dirt, faint letters shimmered in the sunlight. Elysium Queen. He whispered the name aloud, his voice dry and cracked. It sounded unreal, like a memory from someone else's dream. Victor circled the hull slowly, his steps echoing against the steel. Each footstep thudded hollowly, the sound swallowed by the emptiness of the valley. He placed his hand on the metal hot to the touch, baked by the sun, and felt its texture beneath his calloused fingers. This was no illusion, no mirage. A real cruise liner, a behemoth meant for the open sea, lay stranded at the bottom of a dead reservoir hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. He walked until he found the stern and traced the ship's outline with his eyes. It went on, immense and silent, the windows dark, the decks hidden behind layers of rust and collapsed balconies. How could it be here? He wondered. How could an ocean liner the size of a city block lie in the middle of nowhere? He had seen derelict ships before, hulls rotting in shipyards, tugboats left to sink. But this was something else entirely. It was like discovering a cathedral buried in the desert. For a while, he simply stood there, hands on his knees, breathing hard. The heat pressed down on him, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. He glanced around, half expecting someone else to appear to confirm what his eyes were seeing. But there was only silence. Not even a bird moved in the distance. The ship's shadow stretched across the dry ground, and he felt suddenly very small, like a boy standing before a monument to some forgotten age. A part of him wanted to run home to tell someone, anyone. But who would believe it? People in the nearby towns barely cared that the lake had dried up. They had their own troubles, failed crops, dying cattle, cracked wells. If he told them there was a cruise ship buried beneath the mud, they'd laugh and say the old fisherman had lost his mind from the heat. So he stayed. He walked closer, finding a place where the hull met the ground. There, half buried under a slope of clay, a set of stairs led upward toward a rusted deck. They were warped, but solid enough to climb. The temptation to go inside gnawed at him, but he hesitated. The air above the hull shimmered like glass, the heat rising in waves. Somewhere inside, he thought, might still be echoes of what this ship had once been. Music, laughter, the smell of salt air. But here it was, stranded in silence, swallowed by dirt instead of sea. He stepped back and sat down on a stone to steady himself. From there he could see the ship's full length stretching across the valley floor. A giant skeleton resting under a blazing sky. The image struck him as both tragic and beautiful, a grave for something that once defied gravity, now humbled by time. He thought of his own life, how he too had once belonged to the ocean, how it had abandoned him when he left it for land. For a long while, he remained there, watching the shadow move slowly across the ground as the sun drifted west. The ship looked almost alive in the changing light, as though it might at any moment groan and stir, remembering what it once was. The wind shifted, carrying a whisper across the valley, and Victor could almost imagine it was the sound of waves. He rose finally, brushing dust from his trousers. His body ached, his mind whirled. But inside him, a strange calm took root. Whatever this was, dream, miracle, or madness, it was real enough to touch. The Elysium Queen had returned to the world, and somehow she had chosen him to witness it. As he began the long climb back toward his house, he looked over his shoulder one last time. The ship's silhouette cut sharply against the horizon, its bow tilted upward as if it were still trying to rise, still longing for a sea that no longer existed. When he reached the ridge, twilight was falling. The sky had softened into bruised purples and red-gold streaks, and the land glowed faintly beneath it. From there, the great ship looked like a sleeping giant, half buried in dreams. Victor felt the weight of what he'd seen pressing in on him. Yet beneath that heaviness, there was also a flicker of wonder. He had spent years living beside the ghost of water. Now the ghost of a voyage had come. To find him, he turned toward home, the first stars blinking above the dry valley. Behind him the steel Leviathan lay still, its name barely visible in the dimming light. He thought of the sea, of the life he had left behind, and of the strange, impossible fate that had brought a piece of the ocean to rest in his backyard. As night fell completely, a cool breeze rose for the first time in weeks. It swept over the valley and rustled through the reeds at the edge of the dried basin, whispering faintly through the open portholes of the ship below. To Victor, it sounded almost like breathing, the exhale of something ancient stirring after decades of silence. He didn't know it yet, but the discovery that day would change everything he believed about loss, about time, and about the sea itself. For even a dead sea, he would come to learn, can still return in another form. And beneath a cracked earth and forgotten steel, the world had just begun to remember what it once was. The night after Victor Tallis discovered the ship was long and restless. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as the fan above him hummed its weary rhythm. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the vast rusting hull rising out of the cracked earth. The image burned behind his eyelids, a monument to something magnificent and impossible. He could still feel the heat of the steel under his palm, the silence that had surrounded him as he stood before it. No matter how he tried to dismiss it as a trick of light or exhaustion, the reality of what he'd seen pressed down on him with the weight of a tide. When dawn came, he was already awake, boots laced, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, and a flashlight tucked into his pocket. By the time he reached the ridge overlooking the drained basin, the first rays of sunlight were sliding down the valley, turning the metal of the Elysium Queen a deep golden red. A thin mist clung to the low ground, and the air was heavy with the scent of hot dust. The ship looked even larger in the morning light, a sleeping giant uncovered by time. Victor stood there for a moment, catching his breath before beginning his descent into the hollow. Each step down the slope stirred little clouds of dust that shimmered in the sunlight. He moved carefully, testing the cracked ground beneath his boots. The air grew hotter the closer he got, the smell of iron and old oil filling his nose. When he finally reached the base of the hull, he felt again that strange sense of reverence, like standing before a cathedral built not for gods, but for ghosts. The ship's name, half buried in mud, seemed to whisper its own history. Elysium Queen. He spent several minutes circling the hull, studying its shape more closely now. The steel plates were warped, the paint long since peeled away, but the form remained intact, a marvel of construction that had somehow survived decades of burial. Near the stern, he noticed a broken ladder clinging to the side, its lowest rungs twisted but still attached. With careful steps, he tested the metal. It groaned but held. Gripping the rope, he began to climb. The air was still and hot, the sound of his boots against the steel echoing faintly upward. The climb wasn't far, but every meter seemed to carry him deeper into another world. When he finally pulled himself onto the deck, his heart pounded from more than exertion. The ship stretched before him, its decks coated in a film of dirt and moss. Rust had eaten through the rails, and weeds had begun to grow in the cracks of the floorboards. A single gull screamed somewhere overhead, startled by his presence. The sound felt strangely out of place, a reminder that the sea was far, far away. Victor began to move slowly across the deck. The wood creaked under his boots, and dust lifted with every step. Near the bow, he found the remains of a dining area. Tables overturned, chairs tangled together as though a storm had swept through. Plates lay scattered across the floor, cracked and faded, some still bearing the logo of the ship's line. He crouched to pick one up, brushing away the grime with his thumb. The letters were barely legible, but they spelled out a name he didn't recognize. Everything here was both alien and achingly familiar. He pushed open a set of glass doors that led into the interior. The hinges resisted, then gave with a groan. Inside, the air was cooler, still thick with the smell of rot and metal. He switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a grand hallway that curved gently upward, lined with tarnished brass railings and mirrors that had long lost their reflection. Dust swirled in the beam of light like mist underwater. Moving deeper, he found himself in what had once been a lounge. The ceiling was high, adorned with fragments of chandeliers that glimmered faintly when his light passed over them. Torn velvet draped from the walls, and the floor was carpeted in a fine layer of silt. He could almost imagine the sound of music here once, the hum of conversation, the faint clinking of glasses, but now only the echo of his own footsteps answered him. In one corner, a row of doors led to small cabins. He opened the first and found a narrow bed, a collapsed desk, and a suitcase still half open on the floor. Inside were the remnants of clothing eaten by mold and time. On the wall above the bed hung a photograph. The glass cracked, but the image intact. A young couple smiling on a deck somewhere, the ocean behind them. Victor stared at it for a long time, feeling something stir deep inside him. This ship had once carried life hopes, laughter, arguments, dreams, and then it had been erased. Entombed beneath the earth like a secret no one wanted to remember. He moved from cabin to cabin, collecting impressions rather than objects. He didn't want to disturb anything, as if breaking the silence would somehow offend the dead. The deeper he went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The air was damp, almost heavy, though there was no water left here. It was as if the ship still remembered the sea, still breathed its memory. Down a slanting corridor, he noticed something peculiar on the wall, a faint line of discoloration running perfectly horizontal from one end of the hallway to the other. He leaned closer and touched it. The metal was darker there, stained in a way he recognized instantly. It was the mark of water, but it wasn't salt. The residue felt clean, almost chalky. This ship had been submerged, but not in ocean water. The realization struck him like a revelation. It hadn't drifted here by some supernatural means. It had been placed here, drowned deliberately in fresh water. He began to imagine possibilities. Perhaps it had been brought inland for repairs, part of some forgotten engineering experiment. Or maybe it had been towed up a river during a flood and left when the waters receded. None of it made sense. Yet the evidence was there. The lines on the walls, the smell of clay instead of salt, the way the hull was buried into the earth as if it had been sitting here for decades. Someone had meant for it to vanish. As he explored deeper, he reached what must have been the grand dining hall. The ceiling rose high above, though parts of it had collapsed, letting shafts of sunlight spill through. Dust motes floated in the golden light like plankton. In the center of the room stood a piano, its keys broken and warped, a relic of some distant elegance. Victor approached it and pressed one of the keys. It produced only a dull, hollow sound, an echo of what it used to be. He stood there for a long time, overwhelmed by the sense of stillness. This place was a mausoleum for human ambition, a reminder of how easily even the grandest creations could be swallowed by silence. And yet, beneath that silence, he felt something alive, a pulse, faint but insistent, calling to be heard. His flashlight flickered, and he turned it toward the far wall, where a wide stairway led upward toward what must have been the bridge. He hesitated, exhaustion tugging at his limbs, but curiosity won. The steps were slick with rust, but they held. As he climbed, he noticed the air growing lighter, filled with the faint scent of grass and open air from somewhere above. When he emerged onto the top deck again, the sun was already lowering toward the horizon. He could see the whole valley from here, the cracked, desolate bed of the reservoir, the hills fading into a haze of gold. The ship's shadow stretched across the ground, immense and unbroken. Standing there, Victor felt an emotion he couldn't name. It was more than wonder, more than fear. It was the sense of standing before something sacred, something that had defied both time and logic. He thought of how many feet had once passed this way. Passengers, sailors, engineers. The thought brought a dull ache to his chest, but not sadness exactly, more like recognition. The ship seemed to breathe again in the silence, its great body settling deeper into the earth. He left the bridge and made his way toward the captain's quarters. The door was half open, the room beyond filled with light. Dust drifted through the air like fine smoke. The control panels were corroded, their dials frozen, but the layout was unmistakable. He stood before the helm, placed his hands on the wheel, and for a moment in the stillness, he imagined the ship alive again. Engines humming, lights glowing, voices crackling through the intercom. It felt almost like a memory of his own voyages, a time when he too had stood before the sea, staring through storms that seemed endless. He looked out through the wide windows at the dry basin below. The view was breathtaking and desolate all at once. The valley stretched in all directions, the land cracked and pale. Yet here, within the rusting walls, was the story of something vast and human. He thought of how history forgets, how it buries its failures as the earth buries its dead. But sometimes when the water retreats, those buried ghosts rise again. When he left the bridge, the sun was already sinking, turning the interior corridors golden. He carried the ledger and a few of the blueprints with him, wrapped carefully in his jacket. As he descended the stairs and crossed the deck toward the open air, he paused once more to look at the valley beyond. It seemed to him that the light had changed since the day before, sharper somehow, as if the world itself had woken up to what it held. Back home, he spread the documents out on his kitchen table, the surface covered in maps, notes, and photographs. The drawings of pipes and turbines looked alien against the rough wood. He sat for a long while in silence, tracing the lines with his finger. There were codes, serial numbers, and signatures he didn't recognize. But one emblem repeated throughout, the same twin rings he had seen on the ledger. Beneath them, a motto in Latin half faded by age. Aqua memoriam tenet. Water holds memory. The phrase lingered in his mind long after the light outside had dimmed. Perhaps that was what this place truly was, a memory made solid, waiting for someone to listen. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping over him. But inside he felt a spark of understanding. The reservoir had hidden the ship for decades, guarding its secret beneath the water. Now the drought had returned it to the world, and with it a story that no one had ever meant to tell. As night fell, Victor sat alone with the papers, the silence of the valley pressing against his windows. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the Elysium Queen rested, her rusting heart still holding the echoes of human ambition. And he, a solitary fisherman who had once belonged to the ocean, was the only one left to hear it beating. For the first time in years, Victor Tallis felt a reason to wake before dawn. The discovery inside the captain's cabin and the documents he had spread across his kitchen table filled him with the feverish energy of someone who had glimpsed a forgotten truth. Yet, as the sun crept over the horizon, lighting up the dry valley and the sleeping hulk of the Elysium Queen, that energy turned into a steady determination. He had to tell someone. Whatever had happened here, however long ago, it was no ordinary mistake. There were signatures on the documents, government seals, words like containment or unclassified things that shouldn't have been left to rot in silence. He packed the papers carefully into a weathered canvas bag, pulled on his jacket, and began the long walk toward the nearest town. The road wound through hills baked hard by the drought, the trees skeletal, the air heavy with dust. As he walked, he rehearsed the story in his mind. The drained reservoir, the hidden ship, the blueprints for a secret experiment buried beneath layers of mud. It sounded absurd even to his own ears, like something a lonely man might invent to give shape to his solitude. Still, he pressed on. By midday, he reached the county administration building, a low square structure that sat baking under the sun. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old coffee. A bored receptionist glanced up when he entered. Victor explained that he needed to speak with someone about a discovery, an industrial site, abandoned and possibly hazardous. The receptionist frowned and disappeared behind a door, leaving him standing in the echoing corridor. Minutes passed before a man in a suit appeared, his tie loosened, his expression polite but distant. He introduced himself as Deputy Director Farlow and asked Victor to sit. Victor laid the photographs on the table, the hull rising from the cracked earth, the blueprints, the stamped documents. The man leaned forward, brows knitting as he looked. When Victor finished explaining, silence fell between them. Farlow's fingers drummed lightly on the desk before he spoke. "You say this is in the old Cradle Basin?" he asked, voice flat. "That reservoir has been decommissioned for years." Victor nodded. Farlow flipped through the pages again, then sighed. "I'll send someone to take a look," he said. "These kinds of things happen. Military scrap, flood debris. Nothing to worry about." It wasn't the reaction Victor had expected. There was no surprise, no disbelief. Only a tired indifference like a man listening to a story he already knew. "You don't understand," Victor said. "This isn't debris. It's an entire ship, a cruise liner, and there are documents linking it to a government project." But the deputy only smiled faintly. "Of course," he murmured. "And we'll make sure it's handled properly. Leave your address in case we need more information." When Victor returned home that evening, the valley seemed colder, though the air was still thick with heat. He waited for days, expecting a team to arrive, some official convoy of trucks and engineers. Instead, there was nothing. No phone call, no letter. On the fifth night, as he sat outside his house, watching the sky turn from copper to black, he saw lights flicker at the far edge of the basin. Headlights moving slowly along the dried bed, then stopping near the ship. He stood shading his eyes, but the distance swallowed the details. The lights remained for hours, unmoving before vanishing into the dark. The next morning, he walked down to the basin again. The ground was scarred with fresh tire tracks. Near the ship's stern, the earth was disturbed, as if heavy equipment had been parked there. A metal stake protruded from the mud, marked with red paint. No one was in sight, but the evidence of recent work was clear. A low unease settled in his stomach. The silence of the authorities was not ignorance. It was intent. They already knew about the Elysium Queen. They had known for decades. Over the following week, the tension grew. Each night, he saw lights moving near the valley, and each day, new signs appeared. Footprints, fresh marks on the hull, the faint scent of oil. Once from his porch, he caught the distant hum of engines that stopped abruptly when he stepped outside. They were watching, though he couldn't say for whom. Perhaps they wanted to remove the ship quietly, or bury it again under another flood. He imagined them digging pipelines, sealing entrances, erasing history with bureaucratic precision. He tried again to speak with officials, calling every number listed on the faded county pamphlet. Most didn't answer. One man, when Victor mentioned the project's name, Helix, hung up without a word. It became clear that no help would come from above. They wanted this story to stay buried. But Victor, restless and angry, could not accept that the ship had chosen him. Or so he believed. Now if he stayed silent, the truth would drown again, this time under paperwork instead of water. On a humid evening thick with the smell of approaching rain, he made his decision. Sitting at his kitchen table, he spread the photographs out once more, arranged them neatly, and began to write. The letter was addressed to a regional newspaper, the Northern Chronicle, known for publishing stories the government preferred to ignore. He wrote simply, without embellishment, describing what he had found of the ship, the documents, the evidence of secret engineering. He enclosed copies of everything he had uncovered and ended the letter with a single line. If this disappears, it will not be the earth that buried it this time. He mailed the package the next morning, walking 10 miles to the nearest post office to ensure it left the valley. As he returned home, a feeling of both dread and relief settled over him. Whatever happened now, the secret was no longer his alone. 2 days later, the world shifted. The story appeared online first, small and unassuming, buried beneath headlines about politics and weather. Fisherman discovers lost ocean liner in dried reservoir. Within hours, it spread. Photographs of the Elysium Queen, its rusted hull, its vast skeletal decks circulated across news sites. By nightfall, reporters were calling it the ship in the desert. Television crews arrived, helicopters buzzing overhead. The once empty valley became a pilgrimage site for the curious and the skeptical alike. From the ridge above his home, Victor watched as strangers filled the basin, their flashlights flickering like stars against the massive shape of the ship. Some carried cameras, others simply stood in awe. The authorities tried to cordon off the area, but it was too late. The world had already seen. At first, Victor felt triumphant. He had broken the silence. But as the days passed, the triumph turned to unease. Trucks appeared again, this time bearing official seals. Men in dark uniforms set up barriers, keeping the public at a distance. Journalists were escorted away. Someone erected a metal fence around the site, and soon after the entrances to the ship were welded shut. A press release followed. Cold technical language claiming the ship was an obsolete industrial test structure unrelated to any classified projects. The media frenzy dwindled, replaced by new distractions. Standing alone on the ridge one evening, Victor realized the story was already slipping away, absorbed into the machinery of control. Yet, he felt no regret. The secret was out, even if distorted. The ship would never again be entirely hidden. People had seen it with their own eyes. Photographs lived on the internet now, beyond anyone's power to erase. The rain began one night without warning, a slow patter, soft as breath on the window pane, then steadier, heavier, until the sound filled the valley like an awakening heart. Victor lay in bed listening to it, the rhythm unfamiliar after years of drought. It came down with a kind of purpose, as though the sky had been waiting for its moment. He rose before dawn, wrapped himself in his coat, and stepped outside. The air smelled of iron and wet earth, and for the first time in many seasons, the dust that had clung to everything was gone. Down in the basin, the ship was barely visible through the rain, its hull glistening beneath a sheen of water that ran along the metal like tears. The ground around it had darkened, the cracks filling with rivulets that merged into slow-moving streams. The Elysium Queen seemed almost to breathe again, its decks glistening in the gray light, the sound of raindrops echoing faintly through the hollow corridors. Victor stood there for a long while, hat pulled low, rain soaking his shoulders, and felt a strange certainty settle in him. Something was coming to its end. Over the following days, the rain did not stop. The news called it an anomaly, an atmospheric inversion, a shift in weather patterns after years of dryness. Rivers that had been mere scars began to stir. The valleys turned to mud. The old reservoir, once dead, began to live again. From his porch, Victor could see pools forming where there had been only dust. The earth drank greedily, as though trying to make up for all the years of thirst. He returned to the ship daily, even as the mud thickened and the paths grew treacherous. Each time the water had crept higher, it began at the keel, tracing its way up the hull like a memory returning to the body. By the 5th day, the lower decks were submerged. By the 7th, the bow sat mirrored in a shallow lake, the reflection trembling with every raindrop. The Elysium Queen was reclaiming her element. Standing at the edge, Victor felt both awe and sorrow. He had known this would happen someday. Nature had always intended to finish what men had interrupted, but watching it unfold was like witnessing a burial and a resurrection at once. The ship that had risen from the earth was now descending back into water, not as an artifact, but as something alive again, whole in its surrender. The weather worsened. Thunder rolled across the hills, deep and distant. The water in the basin rose faster now, forming a dark, glassy surface that stretched wider each hour. Victor watched as the last of the fences disappeared beneath it, the posts sinking quietly into the flood. The ship floated slightly, tilting as if testing her weight, then settled again. It was a haunting sight, a massive vessel stranded between two worlds, waiting for the water to decide her fate. By the 10th day, the rain became relentless. Streams turned to torrents, and the lake spread across the valley, swallowing everything in its path. The air smelled of salt, though they were far from the sea. Victor took his small fishing boat from behind the shed, a remnant of another life, and pushed it toward the growing waterline. He had not planned to sail again, yet the pull was irresistible. The Elysium Queen was calling, not in sound, but in presence, as though she wanted one witness to her final journey. He rowed slowly across the widening lake, the oars dipping into dark water that reflected the clouds above. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the horizon. When he reached the ship, he tied the boat to a protruding ladder and climbed aboard. The deck groaned softly under his weight. Water ran in streams along the railings, dripping into the newly formed sea below. The air inside smelled of rust and rain, a mingling of decay and renewal. He made his way to the bridge as he had done so many times before. The windows were streaked with water, and beyond them the valley was vanishing beneath the flood. The sound of rain on metal was deafening, steady, eternal. He stood before the wheel, his hands resting on it lightly, and closed his eyes. For a moment, the years peeled away, and he could almost feel the ship moving again. The hum of engines, the sway of the sea, the creak of wood and steel. But this voyage was different. It was not a return to men's oceans, nor a resurrection of power. It was something quieter, a yielding. The ship was not fighting the water this time. She was welcoming it. Victor felt it in the way the hull shifted, in the way the sound of rain merged with the rhythm of unseen waves. He stayed there until dawn, half dreaming, half listening, as the ship and the storm conversed in a language older than any he knew. When the sun finally rose, weak and pale, the rain had eased. A dense mist hovered over the water, hiding the edges of the world. The Elysium Queen floated now, not fully, but enough to move gently with the swell. Victor stood at the rail, staring into the gray expanse that had once been a dry grave. He felt no fear, only calm. The ship was leaving him, and he understood that this was how it had to be. He descended the ladder once more, his boots splashing into the shallows. Behind him, the vessel loomed vast and silent, her reflection perfectly still. He pushed the small boat away from the hull and began to row back toward the distant shore. The mist thickened around him, and soon the ship was little more than a silhouette, a ghost dissolving into the water it had been denied for so long. By the time he reached the land, the sun had broken through the clouds. The valley was transformed. The dry cracks had become streams. The mud had turned to ripples. It was no longer a desert nor quite a lake, but something in between, alive, changing, breathing. Victor stood on the shore, the oars resting across his knees, and watched as the Elysium Queen drifted slowly away, her vast body gliding into the fog like a memory returning to its source. He remained there until she vanished completely, until only the sound of water remained. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "Welcome home." In the weeks that followed, the rains continued, but softer, steady enough to keep the new lake alive. The valley filled gradually until only the tallest parts of the ship's superstructure remained visible above the surface. By midsummer, even those were gone. Travelers passing through the hills spoke of a lake that had appeared almost overnight, calm and mirror-like, said to be bottomless. Some claimed to see strange shapes beneath the surface when the sun was low, the suggestion of windows and railings deep below. Victor never went back. He moved closer to the coast to a small village where the sea still breathed in rhythm with the wind. Sometimes as he walked along the shore, he would watch the waves and imagine that somewhere beneath them, the Elysium Queen still sailed not on the ocean of the world, but within the greater sea of memory. The years passed, and the story faded into legend. Yet on quiet nights, when the rain fell just right and the horizon blurred into silver, some fishermen swore they heard the faint echo of a horn carried by the wind, distant and sorrowful. They said it came from the inland lake that should not exist, from a ship that no longer was. And perhaps they were right. For in every drop of water that falls upon the earth, there lies a trace of all that has ever sailed upon it. And in that endless circulation between sky and sea, memory endures soft, persistent, eternal like the whisper of the Elysium Queen, calling to those who still remember the sea that no longer exists. If you were amazed by this story, make sure to subscribe right now. New shocking discoveries are coming soon. Don't miss the next video and share this one with your friends. Let's see how far this mystery can travel.